This is a video over your discussion for the third week. And I want to start out by uh, pointing out, if people would look at Lillian Reinisch, I'm sorry if I mess up your name, but Lillian, and you had mentioned the word culture. Culture, when you teach your kids that you use the word culture, C for clothing, U for menu, that's food, L for language, T for art, U for music, R for religion, and E for education. And that seems to do a good job of covering a lot of the basics. I would ask everybody to look at that. That's a really nice way to take the term culture and then highlight certain letters that that this is an aspect of culture. And the main thing with kids, of course, just like I think with you and I talk about stuff, is I want to hit the basics so that you can recall it. I don't want to give you something complicated you'll forget shortly. So the word culture. And by the way, I was so impressed with the discussion. And I had so much, I've written a lot of notes. But I was going to talk more about individuals, but I think I'm not going to do that. I think I'm going to kind of move to the really main ideas. And so I'll mention things and you'll know if you talked about those. When you talked about the culture and family, it was a really nice mix because we had discussion about the Netherlands and the way the Dutch are, but we also had discussion. It was actually in my other class, but I'm going to mention it here. The people had mentioned in my other class, people mentioned their European families like Polish, Italian, and Irish, and that these, even if they were closer to the European or knew the European relatives, that still those threads are really strong. And you have this network that kind of is your safe place, and it's not a cage, but it's your nest. Maybe that's the word I like. And what are the parts of that nest? Well, looking in these, I saw people talk about relationship with the land. There's some discussion, do you eat organic food? Are you a meat eater or vegan or something? Not too many vegans. Most people hunted and put away their food. So a lot of talk about that. So it was, and the obligations of family are huge. Most of you had kind of an extended family, which people now in the United States would think odd, but because of the rural nature of Nebraska, and for some of you, the fact that you come from a place where you still maintain contact with your family, at least on, internet or Facebook, that you still have these obligations. You go and see grandma. A lot of you mention rules about, in some cases, I remember reading that if the elders decide something and you're a kid, then you follow the rules, you follow the order. That's probably not really true in most of modern American society, that kids just are quiet and follow the rules. But I kind of enjoyed it because it reminds me of a time when I was younger that was the way things were. Other things that stuck out. Well, the rules for kids, and I remember I mentioned it yesterday, but I remember there was a funeral and somebody was at their grandmother's funeral, and this may be in the other class, but what struck me as they were talking about how everybody performed their task. They cleaned up after the funeral dinner, after their grandmother's funeral. And it really was the family. They continued to function. The rhythm of life continued, even though the grandmother passed on, that the family allowed continuity and stability. And that's what I really, really enjoyed in reading in both classes about this. I really enjoyed Leah. I'd made some notes about this before I got into all these, but mentioning first two or three, you mentioned New Jersey and Texas. um, Brittany, you'd mentioned, I guess it was Brittany mentioned New Jersey and Texas moving, and um, how those two places are really different. So if you've lived two different places, whether it's Hong Kong and Michigan, or whether you've lived in the Netherlands or um, somewhere in the United States, you have this good contrast. Um, I thought it was really interesting because I kind of know about Texas culture. I wouldn't know much about New Jersey culture, but everything's different. You know, the level of noise, the level of interaction in the household. Some people had a very quiet house and sedate in the extended family. Others, like the Italian family, I remember somebody mentioned it, cousins running everywhere. So, but you have this, and I like the word nest for it. I kind of came up with that because the nest gives the idea that you have a group. This is your safety net, and it's a place where you're allowed some freedom, but you also have protection. Particularly as a young kid, you have many role models, many mentors, and this has got to be very, it's got to have a sense of safety with it. Whether you live in a certain part of a farm area and you have a lot of cousins around you, or whether you live in an urban area but you have a lot of relatives that you're around. Um, so I think in culture that's got to be huge. And I was thinking that some of you mentioned that your husband, one of the people mentioned, your husband reminded you not all kids have the same deal that you had. And so you have to think about different types of families, or families of either divorce or families where maybe the kid was in a foster home or something. But everybody's trying to create that nest and maintain themselves. Um, And a lot of you, because of your travels, you have the advantage of having experience being in other cultures. Hong Kong, and the ones I remember: Netherlands, Hong Kong, Japan. Some people have been to Mexico, or lived there, or had relatives there, and that you were able to contrast. And then you had to kind of find your own way, because if you married someone from a different culture or even just a different religion, you kind of had to compromise on a lot of things. And of course, I've been married 35, 39 years. I was off on that one. But you know, all of life is creating your own little version of your culture. And so those of you that are bicultural or multicultural because of the nature of where you live, that you have to make certain compromises to live within that culture. And so you create your own hybrid version of it. But still, at times, there may be aspects of the culture you're living in that you may not really like it, and you can't compromise, you can't accept it. For instance, I noticed somebody mentioned their kids, that if you're growing up in another culture and you feel that there may be something in that culture that would make life difficult for your child, maybe bullying, or whether they can fit in. You know, that's another issue. And I realized that some people had moved because they wanted, when they were older, they wanted to live in a smaller town and not an urban area like a city like Denver or something. That was another issue that came up. So you're always, it's like you have this console where you're trying to control everything. I'm using different metaphors, forgive me. And you're constantly pushing back and forth, you know, too collective, too individualistic, trying to get in the middle, language use, not only the proper language use, but also which languages are used. I know as an ESL person, I know that's a big area of tension. Respect for the home language, but respect for the language that the children are learning. Same thing with sports. I thought, you know, and somebody mentioned football in Texas. Yeah, football is religion in Texas. It really is, at least in my opinion. I know some other things about education, and there were some issues about a generational poverty or that maybe one part of their family, they didn't really finish high school or didn't go to college. Another side of the family, they did. And then you're kind of the person that's different because you came from the side that didn't go to college, but you went to college. And so now you have people, and I had that happen to me, people in the side of the family that's more, and I want to say blue collar, still you could go to college, but I had a side of the family where most people didn't go to college. And so I went and got a doctorate. And so, it was like, wow, he has a doctorate. He's a doctor. I mean, it's not like I do anybody any good, right? I'm not a medical doctor. But the point was that people treated me differently and they were a little nervous around me, or they didn't like me. They just didn't have much to do with me because they thought I would be arrogant toward them. And I'd like to say I would never do that, but who knows? When I was younger, I was all over the place. But when you form your family, you really have to form the culture. You've got all these decisions and everything from religion to how you're going to talk about work. And work was really interesting because I remember in one of the, somebody mentioned that in their family, or maybe it was their grandfather, but sometimes hard work takes precedent over time with family because hard work is associated with having enough money, and enough money is one of the aspects of taking care of your family. So sometimes there are people that say, look, let's stay home, let's take a day off. And other people say, no, I'm obligated, I'm supposed to be at work, I can't take a sick day and fake it. And so you get this tension. And I notice it particularly in blue collar or in farm families, because I grew up in a farm family in in Missouri. And I'm sure my mother would never have thought of just taking a day off. I don't remember ever doing that unless she was sick and couldn't go to work because she needed her job. My dad was a farmer. You could make it on one check. Which reminds me of the joke about the farmer that won the lottery. Some of you have heard this. They said, well, he's struggled as a farmer, but he won $10 million. And they said, what are you going to do now? He says, well, I'm going to keep farming until it's gone. Ta-da. I need those little symbols. Okay, so anyhow, so education becomes a big deal, especially in the family about your own kids. And getting kids to work hard and how important that is, and to save their money and to budget, because we might have a Dutch uncle. There used to be a stereotype, which I was interesting reading about the Dutch, that they are frugal. So, and I realize, they've had to push back the North Sea for hundreds of years in order to get their land. If you don't know about that, look up the Zuiderzee, I think it's called, if I remember my geography. But the Dutch have freed up a lot of arable land by damming up or putting up dikes and blocking and et cetera. I don't know all the dynamics of it. Another thing that was important is mentioned was politics, and particularly in Nebraska, but not in other places. People will say, well, I'm not really a conservative Republican anymore, or I'm not really a super conservative person, but I'm careful not to agitate people by putting a sign out saying I'm for so-and-so, and maybe 2/3 of the town hates that person. So, but what does that mean? That means you don't go out and accentuate your differences, whatever those differences are. Your opinion about LGBTQ issues, or your opinion about politics, or your opinion about, if I put a thing out, promoting veganism, and I'm in a town where they raise beef, there'll be people who get really agitated. What do you mean you don't eat beef? I'll eat something that looks like beef, but it has to be veggie. My experience is I went through the slaughter plants on my ESL tours to help my students understand what people do working in the plants, how tough it is. And after my second tour, I lost my ability to even consider eating beef. Can't do it anymore. However, in my lifetime, I've eaten rabbit and squirrel fairly often, and you probably would find that terribly gross. I haven't eaten any squirrels lately. I deadpan it. But anyhow, so hunting is connected to food, but sometimes hunting's connected to political issues. So you kind of got that, hunt guns are tools, and certainly they are tools. Of course, there's a lot said about violence and stuff and certain types of weapons, which I would argue about there. Stuff I really enjoyed, Barbara Raya. I really liked people going out of their way when they dealing with other cultures, thinking about what is respectful and what's not respectful. I like that you mentioned about punctuality, but it depends on what culture you're in. In Hispanic culture, showing up earlier on time is actually a faux pas in most cases, especially in traditional place. Sometimes you become bicultural and biternal. I don't know what the term is for two aspects of time. Other ones that I really liked, Lindy, you mentioned about living in a small village in Nebraska and how it was very high context, which means not everything's written down. You have to figure out what's going on. So you always don't know what to do. When you move to a small town, you may make mistakes. You may speak in a certain way. And then people will say, hey, that's an unusual way you're talking. Are you from so-and-so or someplace? I was really kind of shocked when, Emily, you mentioned in California, you said ma'am, and people actually yelled at you. Oh my gosh. People serving you are upset because you said the word ma'am. So I'm used to people saying ma'am. I don't normally use it, but I'm very familiar with it and do use it when I'm in certain states. And so I understand, but I didn't realize people are so hyper about it. People will find out who you are sometimes. And when they find out who you are, they're going to maybe kind of isolate you, treat you a little differently, go on defense. They'll kind of isolate you that way. There are places in California, Alyssa, you mentioned about hunting. I'm sure places in California where if you mention you hunted, people would consider you nothing short of being a murderer because you actually eat meat. Or I know a guy I'm friends with out in Washington State, and he's now into rescuing pigs so they won't be slaughtered. So I never posted anything about bacon. I'm sorry. I'm afraid I'll get yelled at. On Facebook, you got to be careful. Waving hello to people is a big deal. Somebody had mentioned in here, I don't know where it was, you don't wave to people if you don't know who they are. If you're driving down the street, people say, what are you doing? We don't wave to people here. And I remember in Missouri, we debate things like, I'm driving and the guy's got his hands on his pickup and he'd do this, and people said, would he give you the finger? I said, no, my dad would do that because he wouldn't wave because he needed to keep both hands on the steering wheel. So I thought that was pretty cool. Morgan, you had something I noticed in here about Wood River and the flooding. And that was something that I'd never thought about. I always told people Nebraska rarely floods, but that's changed now. And you're right, Sarah, Missouri is not that pretty. And I don't really care for the South Missouri where it's all woods. I'm a northern Missouri person, not a southern Missouri. And of course, Thomas, Michigan. I got somebody in Michigan in the other class and they mentioned this and I was going to give them the sign, Michigan and then this, I forgot about that. You've got your hands as geography. That's amazing. And of course, Morgan and Thomas, you live in Hong Kong, and and I remember one of my students, and I don't know if it's this class or the other class, where they were working in Japan, and the labor laws for foreigners are enforced differently than they are for Japanese. So they told this person in the other class, they said, you get to work holidays, but you don't get paid because it's off the clock. And overtime is off the clock. You don't get paid for it. This person was very upset and had to quit their job because they just said in the courts here, foreigners don't have standing on labor laws, which I didn't know that. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'd imagine somebody told you get to work on the holidays and you don't even get paid. This guy's getting paid. That would, Americans, that's a no-go. And then, Jennifer, you talked about religion and hunting and cultural values. And it's really interesting about religion. We don't quite know what to do. Some people get very upset if you don't marry in the same church and they won't go to the wedding. Some people expect you to believe in what they think is the same God, but you can be a different Christian version of religion. Or some people, and I'd mentioned, I think last night when I was talking about respecting people regardless, but it makes it tough. Megan, your shoe budget. Oh, well. I like that. Family is very close and stuff. And there's different types of Catholics and different types of Methodists and different types of atheists and different types of Muslims, I'm sure, in different groups. Now, I grew up eating in front of the TV, Jennifer. You mentioned that in here. The Mennonite town. Katie, you mentioned the Mennonites. I think it was Katie. Yeah. And I don't know much about Mennonites. I grew up around Amish, and that was, I didn't really know them personally, but they were always around. So occasionally they would come out and work on our neighbor's farm or help with construction. You always have to drive out and get them because the Amish don't use vehicles. Excuse me. But you mentioned about people helping each other. And I thought the really nice piece in here from Cindy, when you talked about generational poverty and different sides of the family, it was a really, that struck me. I'd mentioned that before, that came to memory. And again, Lillian, your culture example. Oh, here's one that really struck me. And Robin, I noticed it, you talk about the Dutch, but I noticed it when I moved to Lexington. When you move to small towns or to different places, it's very high context. You think you can fit right in and people are friendly, but they're friendly, but you're still not part of the group. You're still outside the inner circle. And you may think you're in, and you may think you can talk to people, but you understand there's an undercurrent. There's another circuit of people that are interacting and working, and you're not privy to that. You're not quite in on that. And so that's something I noticed about Nebraska. That's just my feeling, that when you move to a town, but you don't, I'd mentioned to you, somebody said that you won't be a part of this town until you have a kid here, or your kids are in school for several years. And that's true. I believe it. I believe that, when I came into Lexington, and I saw this in other towns, there was the original population, which was basically European American or white, whatever you want to call it. And they had their own little group there. And then the Hispanic group came in and they had their own group there, but they weren't necessarily mixed in at all. They kind of concentric circles around each other, however it was fitted. Very interesting. And so you realize that you couldn't be part of something because you didn't, I understand with another culture, you don't have the language ability, so it makes a difference. Oh, and Brittany, you talked about New Jersey and Texas. That's the one. Okay, I know I've talked too much, but I really appreciate these. I think this is practically a textbook on local culture. And I'm looking forward to reading your papers this week. It's going to take me a while because, I don't read everything super fast, but I am so enthusiastic. So I'm going to do a video for the other class and about their version. And I want to thank you for your excellent discussion, and everybody gets full credit.